finding and communicating the story. This is lesson 2, and we're talking about working with qualitative information. Here is the schedule for the whole series. So back in February, we had an introduction and overview, focusing in particular on what are frameworks and how do we use them. After this session, we've got one on quantitative information, then one on multiple streams of data and big data, using visualization, and by using visualization, I mean using it to find the story in the data and using it to help predict the story in the data. And then we're going to have presenting the story as the final part of this series. So the agenda today, we're going to look at an overview of the frameworks approach, just very, very quickly. Anybody who wants a fuller picture, please go back to the previous one. Then we're going to have a little bit of a think about what is qualitative information and the implications for finding the story. How might we set about the qualitative analysis, the particular elements of finding the story, and then how do we communicate the story found from those qualitative data and information. So, first of all, the frameworks approach. As I say, the first lesson covered this in depth, but I do want to review it because not everybody has had a chance to either attend the first session or download the recording and have a look at it. It's a lot about defining and framing the problem. A problem properly defined is a problem half solved. We need to establish what is already known and what is believed and what is expected. So we probe what people think the results are going to be. We probe qualitatively, always, even when it's a quant project, we probe qualitatively amongst the stakeholders to see what are the things that they believe. We want to organize the data. So if we're using a frameworks approach, we will have a systematic way of organizing data so that it can be worked on with the team, so that people can go back to it at a later date, and that we get a reliable quality product. We want a systematic analysis process. We want to know what are the tools we're going to use, particularly important when we're working with teams, but also if intuition doesn't solve it, then you need a systematic approach. And finally, a method of extracting and creating the story. So here is a very simple diagram from that first lecture that looks at what the top part of the framework might be. Who is the project for? What is the business issue problem that's being addressed? What does the business want to do once it's addressed this issue? Knowing the steps they want to take can be really important. What do we already know? So here we've got some reports, some ideas held by, a brief description of them. Assumptions and predictions. Who predicted what? Who predicted what? So that is a little bit about frameworks. There's plenty more in the previous notes. There's plenty more in David Smith's wonderful book, which I've got here in front of me, The Art and Science of Interpreting Markets Research Evidence. So that's frameworks. So let's stop a moment and think about what do we mean by qualitative. And probably the first thing we have to say is that there is no single perfect description. Definitions are often a matter of degree. Something isn't always definitely qualitative or definitely quantitative, and some things are neither qualitative nor quantitative. But here are a few thoughts. Qual always includes human judgments as part of the analysis. So when we look at all the components of the analysis, the researcher is an integral part of that process. Quant is algorithmic. Now, sometimes that algorithm is simple as add all the numbers and divide by the number of numbers you've got, and that will tell you the average. That is an algorithm. In fact, add up all of the numbers is an algorithm. The objective in quantitative research is to remove or more realistically minimize the human role. So in qualitative, we're embracing the human role, and in quantitative, we're trying to minimize it at the point of conducting the analysis. Qual is about meaning and about understanding. Quant is about quantification. Now, sometimes they blur because you try to quantify the meaning and quantify the understanding. But fundamentally, those are a couple of the differences there. Qual deals with all sorts of information, including unstructured information. Sometimes we say Qual is about unstructured information. Well, it doesn't have to be. The data can be quite structured and you can still conduct qualitative analysis. Quant, on the other hand, requires the data to become structured, and a word I'm going to use 2 or 3 times, operationalized. Qual tends to look at within case information. So if we're trying to understand breakfast making, we will look at 16 people, 30 people, 6 people, and we will follow those people all the way through the breakfast thinking process. And we will look at them in depth, and we will trace events within individual people and within individual households. Quant tends to look across cases and say, here are 1,000 people who've had breakfast and here are some of the things they did, and I will try to make a picture out of all of those. Neither of these are perfect. Truth would say we would like to look at lots of people in depth, analytically, but we have to make trade-offs when we do research. And one of those trade-offs is, are we looking across people to understand it, or are we looking inside what individuals are doing? And that is one of these big differences between a lot of qual and a lot of quant. So here's a little bit of a picture way of thinking about the difference between qual and quant. We've got a business problem. We're going to put a new door on the building, and we've got a couple of choices. Is door A the better door, or is door B the better door? Maybe you can stop and think about it for a moment and decide which door you would prefer us to use. Now, we could find out the right answer in lots and lots of ways. We could have some focus groups or some in-depth interviews, and we might determine that A is the preferred door by left-handed people and B is preferred by right-handed people. We also might find out that one group is much more insistent than the other. So maybe right-handed people think that A is simply wrong, whereas left-handed people would say, well, A is better, but B is what we get a lot of the time, so I guess I could live with it if we get it. So it's not just about how many people think something, but why do they think it, and how intensively do they think it? We might take an ethnographic approach if it was something more difficult than just this door handling. We might watch people tackling a variety of doors and other objects around the office and determine that people who tend to favor their left prefer A. So right-handed people who've got their hand in a bandage probably preferring A. Left prefers and vice versa. So we might get a much richer picture with ethnography, but we would have to look very deep to make sure we got all of the meanings. We might recruit a usability professional who would assess the options based on experience and criteria, and that's a qualitative way. And they would come back and say, well, some people can prefer A because of this, and some will prefer B because of this, and we think that actually you'll get more acceptance if you do this option. Or they may have an absolutely fixed scoring system, and in which case it's a quant approach to it via operationalizing, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Or we could conduct surveys. So we might do a survey and discover that 90% prefer B. And that's a quantitative approach, and it doesn't tell us why they prefer B, and maybe that's okay. Or if we were incredibly lucky, maybe on that survey we included a variable, are you left-handed or right-handed? And now we see that the right-handed people prefer B and the left-handed prefer A, and then we take a picture of the door handles and we see what the reason is. Because even if we had the quant approach and we had the data but no picture of the door, we wouldn't necessarily know what the reason was, even if we knew right-handed people preferred B and left-handed people preferred A. So that's quant. Or we might include an open-ended question. So we ask people, do you prefer A or do you prefer B? And then we say, why did you prefer it? And when we look at what people said, we would probably find that some people are saying, oh, it's easier for right-handed people. And some people are saying it's easier for left-handed people. A lot of people would be saying it's easier for me, or it's better for the hand that I use the most, without telling us left or right. Other people were saying it looks pretty, it looks better, it just seems right. So we would look at those open ends, and we might code them, but actually coding would potentially tell us less, because we would read them and would say, yes, some people understand why they prefer A or B, and those people have told us the reason is one is much easier for left-handed people, one is much easier for right-handed people. So from that, we can move forward and take the analysis in lots of different ways. However, when it comes to the actual presentation and the decision before the presentation, which is the best store, that is actually a qualitative decision. You take on board the data, but unless you have some rule in your organization that says we will always implement whatever has the highest vote or the opinion of the highest paid person in the office, how you interpret all of those pieces of data, whether you've gone the focus group, the ethnographical approach, the usability approach, or a quant survey, is a qualitative decision. And that is the link within all of that. So I'm just taking a quick pause. We've got one query from attendee. Okay, so we've got somebody who can't quite join us, unfortunately, at the moment. Probably best if he re-logs in. I'm just going to type a message to him. An interesting thought about all market research is qual starts as qual. Quantitative research, however, also starts as qual. So if we have a question like, how many drinks did you have today? It sounds like it's a very quantitative thing. But actually, what is a drink? We get this existential question. So if I have a bottle of water with me with a nice sports cap, and I take 2 sips an hour apart, is that 2 drinks or 1 drink? If I take them 2 minutes apart, is it 2 drinks or 1 drink? If I go across to the fountain and I take 2 drinks from the fountain, is that 1 or 2? If there are 20 minutes apart, is that 1 or 2? 2 separate glasses of wine versus a glass of wine that was topped up. All of these questions, they're relatively straightforward, but we have to make a decision. The really common task, I read a bunch of statements or I present them on the screen and ask whether you agree strongly, agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree, disagree strongly. We're treating those as if those are quantified numbers, but actually in the mind of every research participant, there are no numbers. They pick whichever of those words they feel best matches their feeling. That's a very qualitative process. So we need to remember that underneath numbers are these qualitative features. And what happens is this word again, operationalizing, when we move from qual to quant. Qual is analyzed by a human. I'm going to come back on that point slightly in a moment. Quant employs the algorithm. So if we code qualitative data and count the codes, what we are doing is converting it from qual to quant via operationalizing. So we see this a lot with brand mentions. The GRIT study is in the field at the moment, and we are going to see a lot of people typing in on what is the most innovative company, and they will type things like Brain Juicer or Insights or Vision Critical, and they will type them slightly differently. And what will happen is that somebody or something will go through and identify all of those specific mentions to Kantar and code them one way, and all the specific mentions to Zappy and Zappy Store to a particular thing. So it takes that qualitative information and makes it quantitative. We see this a lot with likes and dislikes. We show somebody a commercial, we say, what did you like? What did you dislike? And somebody said, oh, I liked the girl, but I didn't like the can. And that would be coded girl, like, can, dislike. So we have this quite rich information, and it becomes quantified, and we find out how many people said something like the girl in the likes, and how many people said something like can in the likes and in the dislikes. One of the ones that we see a lot at the moment is sentiment analysis. Sentiment analysis takes social media conversation or feedback or letters or really almost anything where there is an ongoing discourse and says, in terms of this brand, how much of it is positive, how much it is negative, and how much is neutral. So we're taking qualitative information and we produce coded numbers. It happens when your teachers and your lecturers marked an essay. They would look at that, they would have a mark scheme, but the extent to which they felt your document matched the mark scheme is a qualitative exercise. One of the kind of scary things for a lot of people is that if you go to the doctor and you possibly have depression, you'll be asked a series of questions. Those questions you're answering in a very qualitative way, and they add up how many you ticked with the appropriate answer, and that says where you are on the scale. So we've turned that into a number. There is something really quite bizarre that goes on in the minds of lots of organizations and clients, in that we treat this quantified qualitative information as hard data, and we treat the information it's based on as soft. Really, there ought to be more parity between the two. Talking about using computers, we can use them in a lot of ways now when we're doing our qualitative analysis. And this is something that your framework in your organization should establish. Now, when I started in research back in the 70s, some of the most important tools we had were scissors and colored pens. You'd photocopy the transcripts, you'd cut them up, you'd color them with pens, and you would end up with categories. Now that is more likely to be done in Word and Excel and tools like that. There's a lot of software out there, computer-aided qualitative data analysis software. There's some free software. As in everything else, most of the really good software you have to pay for. NVivo is a good example of a really useful product. One of the strong reasons that people use it is that it's a data storage, data sharing tool, as well as an analysis tool, and that is very powerful. Text analytics. Now, the worst end, I'm going to come back to wretched word clouds later, but that's one end. At the other end, we would have tools like Leximancer, which do content analysis that put structures to that. These sorts of tools, all of the ones on this page, are really like giving the qualitative researcher steroids. They're giving you tools to make you more productive. They will not do the analysis for you. Sometimes they will make it very hard for you to make a dumb mistake because they will guide you down a particular route. Social media analysis tools, so Brandwatch, Radian 6, Crimson Hexagon, all of these tools. So they've got tools for pulling together qualitative information and doing some of the analysis of it. But again, it won't do it for you unless you're a very trusting and naive person. Coding software, software like a scribe, which enables you to take those brand mentions and things like that and bring it into a structured format. There's a growing number of tools that will help you with photos and videos. I'm finding Google Photos is immensely helpful because it tags a lot of the photos that I'm working with, in addition to me tagging them. Companies like Living Lens are doing great work with making videos more accessible. So once you've found information, you can search for similar information. And frankly, searching is one of the things that's really held video back as a good qualitative tool. So there's a lot of progress being made there. Really important that your framework specifies the tools, the storage protocols, and approach to things like memos, tags, and notes. Ideally, every time you spot something interesting, it should attach a tag to that data. If you've memoed that information, then it will attach that memo to it, all the notes to it, to say what else was the context going on here. Reminding us maybe, if it's a picture of a group of people, not to forget the photographer is one of the people involved in that situation. Now, I put a caveat earlier. All qualitative analysis requires a human. At the moment, at some point in the future, maybe somewhere in the world today, it might be possible for qual data to be analysed by artificial intelligence as well as or instead of humans. Open question, but we should bear that in mind. So let's come to this organising the existing knowledge. we're coming up to do the analysis, and we look at everything we already know. And even though it's a qualitative project, we include all the qualitative information we have and all the quantitative information. We want the stakeholders to summarize what is known and what they think the research will show. We want to make the data accessible. So we want transcripts, we want translations, we want video libraries, we want photo galleries, which is where tools like NVivo come in very useful. To make sure that we have a system of making all that information available. And if you're working in multiple countries, be a little bit cautious about analyzing the English-speaking countries first, because the data is available quicker, and then later come the translations and the transcripts, because actually you may have closed some doors in the analysis if you do that. Data. We don't always use the word data with qualitative information, but semantically it's correct. It's what is done in most of the literature. It includes an incredibly wide and diverse range of things. Notes created by the researchers when observing, listening, and discussing with participants. The open-ended comments in surveys. The entire transcript of a focus group. The video recording of the focus group. Posts in social media, letters to organizations, videos, recordings, transcripts, things uploaded to YouTube. All of this is qualitative data. But so is art. So are the meals, clothes, so are the contents of trash, theatre and cinema, play, activities, interactions, objects, photographs and recordings, observations, and of course, most interestingly, passive data. If you collect the movement data for 10 individuals for a week, you've got an enormous amount of information. You can sit there with them and start to understand why they make the travel decisions they make. What were the factors that led them to do that? What might cause them to travel in a different way? And that's a lot of data. It's not collected necessarily by observation, but it's by passive. It can be really enlightening. Quite often, we'll call these artifacts, and in North America, we'll spell it artifacts slightly differently. So that's just another term we would have for qualitative data, artifacts, whatever. There's a real symbiosis in the collection and analysis process. The first is we establish the question, what is known, and we plan the research. We write the discussion guide or whatever it is that we're going to use for this project. We start doing the research. We conduct some analysis, we update the plan, and we do more research. So let's say we're doing 12 depth interviews. After the first depth interview, we're going to revisit, did the discussion guide work? Did we make some assumptions that were not appropriate? Has this led to some ideas, some hypotheses in our minds that we're going to want to test? After the first focus group, again, likewise. If we're doing a 5-day online discussion, there's such great opportunity to be looking at that information, changing it, updating the plan, and moving it forward. So we don't start the analysis at the end of data collection. We start the analysis before the project goes live, and we keep cycling through analyze, update, do, analyze, update, do as we go through the process. Then we get to the main analysis, and what in academic circles would lead to the writing up, or in the commercial world, to the story and the debrief. There are some interesting differences between academic and commercial analysis of qualitative data. So many of the techniques are used by both, conversation analysis, grounded theory, etc. But timelines vary enormously. In commercial research, you may be expected to do it in a day or a week if you're really lucky. Academic, it normally is months, and it normally is much, much deeper. It is normally much more formal. Success tends to vary. In the commercial world, we are trying to help organizations make a better business decision. In an academic world, you're trying to advance knowledge, which is typically an academic definition of knowledge. So advance a theory, create a theory, validate a theory, challenge a theory are all key parts of that process. In the commercial world, we tend to be more pragmatic, which means we often use a hybrid of techniques. We will often short circuit some of those processes. In academia, it's often more pure, because otherwise when you come to the published stage, you're going to have all sorts of people challenging you about the basic methodology. So just a few of the common analytical techniques. You'll need to look these up if you're not familiar with qualitative research, and perhaps an explanation about the slides. If I were giving a conference presentation in 15 minutes, I'd have very few words on the slides. For this sort of essentially a lesson-based presentation, I want the slides to be materials you can take away and use as a springboard to further research, further reading. So there's a lot more text on the screen than would normally be. Grounded theory is probably one of the classic ones that people say when they're talking about proper analytical approaches. Dates back to the 1960s. It's been continually developed since then and has taken different strands. Done properly, it's incredibly time consuming. So it's not often done properly in commercial research, but it doesn't mean that we can't borrow from it. Look into the data in really tiny detail, find codes, link those codes to theoretical sampling in order to build it up. It's an inductive approach. Generate general theories from specific observations. There are some others. Abductive compares the data with theories and expectations. So this is probably closer to what we do in the commercial world a lot of the time. Identify the non-expected and then in theory abduct, in real English leap from these observations to a new theory that is sufficient and probably correct or sufficiently plausible. Content analysis. This one is also very popular in commercial research, and it's very popular with people who are trying to computerize qualitative research or parts of qualitative research. So the data's coded and categorized, but in content analysis, the frequency of codes and categories and the links between them is taken into much greater account. When you look at a lot of computerized techniques, they will tell you that this code often links to this code, often links to this code, and these codes are much more common. So it's a little bit more counting based, which can be appropriate, particularly if you're talking about really large amounts of discourse. So all the discourse about the referendum on whether the UK should stay in the EU over a period of months, 1 month, content analysis might actually be a very good way of going about it because frequency might be a really relevant feature. Narrative analysis, this again is quite close to what a lot of commercial research does. Focus on the entire text, not subdividing it so much. So you still enter the text, and that's about coding and memoing, interpret the text, verifying, which is trying to find alternative explanations. It's really important that we're not seduced by the most appealing or the first interpretation that we see. Then writing the plot of the story and then illustrating it. So finding quotes, drawings, diagrams, etc. that make sense of it. Conversation analysis is one form of discourse analysis. And discourse analysis looks much more at, and conversation analysis in particular, at what people do when they make meaning. What do people do when they describe things? So it's not so much about the content, but about what they are doing. And I'm going to illustrate that with an example shortly. And thematic analysis is another one that's quite popular in the world of commercial research and academic research. And it's more about themes. So it's a little bit closer to narrative analysis. It looks at patterns, but these are still codes and categories. But it is very strong on the idea that you identify the codes and the categories early in the research, and then you change your discussion guide, you change your interview plan in order to explore these further to build it up. It varies as well from something like grounded theory in that it tends to provide an explanation of the situation and not a grand theory, and that's often appropriate for a market research situation. Another quite different way of pulling this information together is semiotics. Semiotics doesn't require surveys, it doesn't require focus groups, it doesn't require in-depth interviews. It can just use material from the world around us, but it can also be applied to the results of interviews. And it works with the signifier and the signified making the sign. So the word rose signifies the the real rose, but actually the word rose can also signify passion, and the real rose can also signify passion. Semiotics is a great example of why the qualitative researcher is so important. You have to understand the discourse and the signs and the symbols used in that area. If you're doing pharmaceutical research with doctors, you have to know what those terms mean, what those signals mean, and what those signs mean when they're talking to you. So that is why there is such a human element within that process. So I've talked a little bit into the process here of forming an overarching structure. Now, different techniques, narrative analysis, conversation analysis, grounded theory, thematic analysis, would have different names for these pieces. But broadly speaking, the left-hand side of the page is codes. No uniform, no books, school fees. So we're looking at what people said when they were interviewed, and these are interviews with street children about the difficulties of going to school. Those were put into categories. Lack of school materials, unable to pay school costs. Those were put into themes. Can't afford school, physically, emotionally stressed, which end up with this big picture that the street children are not going to school because they have tangible, real problems. It's not because they don't want to go to school. Who knows, it could be that as well, but there are tangible reasons. And when we talk to them, here is the architecture of those reasons. Deciding what to believe and what to interpret. One of the criticisms you sometimes get by people who don't understand qualitative research is, oh, well, half the things that people tell you in a focus group are not true, and that's just lies. Yep, it's a subjective process. It's an interaction between humans. We had a great write-up in the SMR book of Contemporary Answers to Market Research Questions by Sven Arn about one part of the qualitative process, which is, aren't you worried that people in a focus group will interact and bias each other? And he said, no, but they do. It's why we have focus groups. We have focus groups because we want interaction, because we want to expose things that would not come out other ways. We know that some things are less believable, so we don't believe them, and actually we would normally avoid asking questions that generate these sorts of answers. So yes, I always give my children healthy snacks. We're not likely to put much credence by that. Yes, I will buy this new product. People are incredibly nice. Your product has to be really ropey before a lot of people say they're not going to buy it. I always remember to take my medicine. In the UK, about 30,000 people a year with serious ailments die because they forget to take their medicine. It's astonishingly common. So we know that we wouldn't necessarily trust, oh yes, I'm taking it properly. I buy on value, not because of advertising. Yet we do not believe that necessarily. More believable, I have 2 children. There's all sorts of factual stuff, which is pretty reliable. No, I did not like it. When people say no, it's actually much more credible. I'm going to come back to this point a bit more in a moment because it's what we call a dispreferred response. I think men will like this more than women. People are really bad at being witnesses to their own motivations. They're actually very good at looking at other people's motivations. So when we ask people to project and to talk about what sort of people will do this and why do you think they would do it and what sort of benefits would they get out of doing it, we get much better information. Which of these 3 is an odd one out dates back to Kelly and his repertory quiz. Great technique for identifying differences and similarities, and then ask, why is this the odd one out? So there's all sorts of things that we can do in that zone. In terms of believing people, this is a popular internet meme, which is probably more popular with the British than the rest of the world, but pretty popular with the rest of the world too. And it's all about understanding the culture, understanding about the frames and the terms that are used. So if we go right to the bottom, I was a bit disappointed that. British mean I am annoyed that. A lot of other people think it means that we mean it doesn't matter. Next one up. Oh, incidentally, or by the way, the British mean it's the primary purpose of our discussion. Others think, oh, this is not so important because it's just by the way or incidentally. So when we try to use machine analysis of what the British say, we can't use the same settings as we would use for what the Americans say, for example. Otherwise, we're going to miss out on all of that subjective understanding. So this is an example from conversation analysis by a feminist researcher, Celia Kitzinger, a very famous researcher, very famous piece of research. And it looks at a campaign that was very popular on university campuses, telling young women, just say no. If you don't want to have sex, just say no. And what Kitzinger identified is that actually that's a really difficult message, because no is a socially dispreferred response. If I say to you, let's go for a coffee, and you want to go for a coffee with me, you'll say yes. If you don't want to go for coffee with me, you are probably going to say, oh, I'd love to, but I've just got to finish this. Oh, I've got to rush straight off. Oh, actually, so what? We make an excuse for saying no. So no is a dispreferred response. And what Kitzinger did was she looked at lots of discussions about women who had had unwelcome sex and the background to it. And the contrast of just say no is this poster on the right from the Canadian Federation of Students, that there are so many things that mean no. No means no. Not now means no. I'm in a relationship means no. No thank you means no. You're not my type means no. Off means no. I'd rather be alone right now means no. Don't touch me means no. I like you but means no. So looking at the structure of what people say to interpret it is going a long way beyond counting the words that people are using to get the real meaning. So there are some common analytical elements. One of them that you'll hear a lot is saturated analysis. Again, this should be in your framework. Keep going until you stop finding new useful things. One of the dangers with some researchers is that they will stop when they find a really interesting story, but actually there may be more to be found. So you need to keep going until you stop finding new and useful things. You need to put a structure to it. The story you create is not just a collection of all the interesting bits and pieces. So the worst type of qualitative debrief, in my opinion, is one that's got 10 or 20 pages of verbatims, open-ended comments. Here is what people said. Now, that's just a collection of interesting stuff. What I want to know is the architecture. What is the meaning? How does this stuff shape together? What does it inform me to help me make my better business decision? Make notes of what you find, linking back to the data and highlighting examples. With a lot of the tools I've talked about, this is really straightforward now. Don't assume that you will be able to recapture your insight in 3 weeks' time. Make a memo, make a note, tag the data. Identify every verbatim or open-end or picture or object or video section that you might want to use in the presentation. And when you're doing that, you should be looking simultaneously to support and break the hypothesis. The reason you are asking for those hypotheses at the beginning is you are equally happy if you support them or break them. You've got to probably try harder to break them, because our inclination is to be a bit supportive, a bit groupthinky, a bit consensual. So focus quite a bit on breaking those hypotheses. They think that people are preferring A to B because A is cheaper. Maybe they like A more. So we're really going to look and challenge that people are preferring A because it's cheaper. Are people going to this store because it's cheaper, or because they like the limited range, or they like the speed of what's going on? So here is just a very whistle-stop tour of a piece of conversation analysis. Here is a piece of text. That text is available online because it was used as an example for grounded theory, but I've used it here as an example for conversation analysis. So the first thing, and discourse analysis, the first thing we do is we look at the structure of what's being said, and we notice that things in circles. We, pause, we. That's a break, and we sort of, not very sure. People break people. So We've got repairs, disconnects. So this is a really good sign that people are not confident. Then we have this point further down. Well, that's a good question. Is a great indication that it's a bad question. And so what they do is say, well, that's a good question, I don't know. And then they move on to the question that they thought they more confident about, bit of a laughter going in there. So we can see that structure of question where we've jumped into either preventative materials or restorative materials. What do you take into account when you're deciding which one to adopt is the wrong piece of question. It's actually not about preventative or restorative in the participant's mind at this stage. So we can change our discussion guide for the next interview and focus on a slightly different way. But we're also learning this person is a bit nervous, not really confident in the structure. So we use a technique called footing, which is the sort of role somebody plays in a discussion. And here, again, not confident. So we've got we sort of. My own little, he talks it little research. Looking at the literature involved, I've been looking around at this information at different sources. Where does the repetition come? So cost is mentioned once right at the beginning, and it's almost like it's a hygiene factor. This particular person, he or she, feels that they need to talk about cost. They've mentioned it. But what is it that they repeat? They repeat things about reliability. Sorry, that button on the bottom left has dropped a little bit. They repeat about internet sites. These are things that they keep coming back to in their conversation. And in terms of the evaluative terms, I quite like my own research. I don't really trust the research that comes. These internet forums are actually quite good for new products. So we can see that this person wants to gather information themselves. They don't trust the commercial information. They like the places where other people are talking about their experiences. The story, the dentist lacks confidence. He, she mentions cost, but it comes back to the topic of reliability. He, she distrusts research from the manufacturers, tries to do their own research by connecting with people who've used new products via internet forums. Sales recommendation, connect this type of dentist with happy users. Encourage reliability testimonials. Encourage happy customers to be using social media posts, because that's where this person is going to find that information. And that's how we can tie those various strands together in the process. Quick word on word clouds. You may have gathered earlier that I'm not a fan of them. Here's one that my partner Sue York did when she was doing an analysis of the book The Wizard of Oz, and she used a content analysis tool, Leximancer. But she also contrasted that with a word cloud. And if you look here and you think about what you know about The Wizard of Oz, how much of that would you understand from this word cloud? Yeah, you'd know that there was Dorothy and a scarecrow and a woodman and the lion, but really not very much. So we can see how weak the word cloud is. It can sometimes be an entry point into looking at the data, and it can very often be a fantastic way of communicating the story. One of the things we talked about in the first lesson, and I'll come back to in several more lessons, is the way you communicate a story often has nothing to do with the way you found the story. So you may not have used word clouds in the finding of the story, but maybe a word cloud can be a really good way of conveying that story to the client at the end of the process. More about finding the story. So we use the client's question as the lens. We're not just trying to find out what's interesting in the data. We're trying to answer a business question. We're going to tag, code, memo the material as we go through it. We're going to challenge what is known and what is already believed. We're going to find the main story. What are the big things that are clearly true? People like this product, but they are scared it won't deliver. That might be the big finding. There might be some subdivisions within that. That's fine, but we need to know what the main story is before we find the details. Then we find the relevant exceptions and the differences. Create the overall structure, or the plot, if you want, and decide whether or not we're talking about good news or bad news. So we're using the client's question as a lens. So what does success look like? What actions are pending on the results? What do people think is true? What do people think the results will be? All of those are the lens that we're using. There are 4 typical types of story. Good news. You've wanted to do this thing for ages, and that's fantastic. We've got a complete set of green lights. Go ahead with it. It's a simple story. It's a very easy presentation and communication. Good news with caveats. It's a really good idea. People like it, but they're worried about this. Or it's a good idea, but we don't think it will work for people with these needs, requirements, situations. So you might want to flag up in advance that it's not suitable for them, or you might want to modify it so it is suitable for them. That's a relatively straightforward presentation. You just need to make sure that the audience don't confuse it with the good news story. The bad news, but there are some options. Okay, most people didn't like what's the idea, but there is an opportunity here if we do this, this, and this to make it really appealing for this group of people, or we can make these and these changes and then it'd be more generally appealing. And then there's the straightforward bad news. Okay, you've been developing this idea for 4 years. You've now produced these segues, and the bad news is we think you're going to sell almost none of them. They do not fit into people's lives. They do not fit into people's lives for the following reasons. That is a really hard sell. You're telling people that stuff they really believed in isn't going to happen. So when you identify the story, you should absolutely know whether it's good news or bad news, or one of those two states in between, because you know what the client thinks, you know what the client hopes, you know what the client plans to do next. And the way you craft those stories and the way you communicate those stories differs enormously on whether it's good news or bad news. All 4 of those are going to be treated differently. What is good news? What is bad news? It depends what the client wanted to hear and then what they did and what you found in the research. It's a combination of the two, and we're going to see that in a case study from Calvin Klein. Bad news. 5 stages of grief. People often talk about anger, denial, bargaining, depression, acceptance. One presentational report is very rarely going to get through all 5 of those stages in one go. You need to communicate bad news early on. Maybe you want to get the client to come and visit some of those focus groups, because you may know after the first focus group, we're heading into bad news territory. You may want to rescope the research slightly so that you can look at the nature of that bad news better. It should never, ever come as a surprise in the presentation that it's bad news. Facts are almost never enough to tell somebody that the project they've worked on for 2 years, that they love, that they think is fantastic, isn't going to work. It's all about emotions. For example, if you can play a video of a customer completely unable to use this product or appalled at their experience, that is going to be much more powerful than any analysis you provide. So think about how you are going to get back to emotions. And in terms of dealing with bad news, my recommendation is to go back to a point where the expectations match the findings. So if we're talking about segues, these wonderful things, you stand on them, you lean forward, they go forward, you lean back, you go backwards, and the worldwide production so far is less than the forecast production was in the first year. You might start off with how much people liked using them, because that is a very clear finding. If you take people out and you give them a trial on the segues, they love it. So we go back to the point where people did what they expected, they loved them. And then we build up from there, slowly diverging from the path they thought we were going to take to the path which we think is the correct one. We also need to be careful about the way we convey confidence with qualitative research. It comes from the researcher. You actually need to say up front, this is how sure you are. You know, would you do this with your own money? You're absolutely sure, you're pretty sure, you're in 2 minds. Convey that. So don't convey more confidence than you have, but don't convey less confidence. You are the expert. You're the person who've worked with the data. You've probably done some of those interviews. You've done some of those observations. You're the person with the best information. We can utilize triangulation, other sources of information, testable predictions. We think that you should find that the main reason people have quoted when they've returned the product is this, this, and this. The consistency and the coherence of the story. The client knows a lot about it. They should be able to see this story is consistent and coherent in itself and in terms of their world. So here's a brief case study that I'm going to just finish up with. This is from SMR's RW Connect. You can all log in and get the full case study there by Greg Rowland. It was conducted by Semiotic Analysis. And it was a semiotics study. And very, very briefly, they were working for Calvin Klein. Calvin Klein had massive success in the 80s with Obsession, massive success in the 90s with Eternity. And the 2000s was much less successful for them with products like Truth. And the question was, why were the 2000s less successful? And what should Calvin Klein do next? So the analysis, which was semiotic analysis, showed that the success was based on modernism. And for those of you not familiar with sort of Western art terms, that runs from about 1915 to about the 1960s. It's like the filmmaker Bergman, the Leni Riefenstahl, Hitler Olympics, all that black and white and muscle, the starkness of the architecture, Picasso, things like that. And Calvin Klein's success was very much associated with using those codes and symbols. Their failure in the 2000s was identified with moving back to industry codes and signals. So the recommendation from the Semiotic Alliance was go back to using modernism, but go forward. Now, one of the things you can't tell from the case study is whether this was good news or bad news, because it depends on what Calvin Klein believed. If Calvin Klein wanted to go back to modernism, then this would have been a really simple debrief. You would tell them, okay, your instinct is right, you've gone down the blind alley with the wrong codes, go back to these codes. If in fact Calvin Klein liked the new codes, then what Semiotic Alliance would have had to do is go back and get them to understand the success of the 80s with modernism, the success of the 90s with modernism, and then show them that the deficiencies created the problems, and therefore what you do is go forward with the new modernism. They did go forward with the new modernism, and brands like Euphoria have earned them billions of dollars. So that's a success story. It's often easier to get people to print success stories as case studies than unsuccess stories. So just the big picture, you need a frameworks for reliable, effective stories. Define the problem. The problem defined is a problem half solved. Organize the data according to the framework, so everybody is using the same tools and the same approaches. Find the main story and build out from the story. Identify whether it's good news or bad news. Is it confirming or challenging the expectations and beliefs? And then, of course, we get to the engaging, memorable, simple story. And if you've got that architecture, then you should be able to define how a simple story that sums up the whole piece. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll turn to questions.